Hello, can everyone hear me okay? All right. Okay, can everyone hear me? Awesome. Okay, thank you all so much for coming out this evening. My name is Casey. I work for Haymarket. I'm just going to go over some quick housekeeping before we get started, before I pass it along to the wonderful folks at Women and Children First. Bathrooms are through that hallway to the right. And I just wanted to take this opportunity to give some announcements about some cool stuff happening at Haymarket. May 3rd is our May Day barbecue and fundraiser. So if you like the programming we do at Haymarket House, you want to come through, show your support, it would be awesome to have you. Additionally, Enemy Feminisms, TERFs, Policewomen, and Girl Bosses Against Liberation by Sophie Lewis is now out. We are having our in-person Chicago discussion group starting in May. If that sounds interesting to you, you can register using that QR code on the wall and follow Haymarket House on Instagram for more information. Okay, and with that, I'm going to pass it along to Women and Children First.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. My name is Shuli Cook. I'm a bookseller at Women and Children First, Chicago's premier feminist bookstore since 1979. Thank you. I wanted to just start really quick tonight by acknowledging that we are on the unceded homeland of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi nations. Many other tribes, such as the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, Sac, and Fox, have also called this area home. And today, Chicago has one of the largest indigenous communities residing in the United States. At the store, we're doing our best to go beyond words to the work of supporting Native community and literature. And so we encourage you to check out the American Indian Center of Chicago and encourage you to look into the social, cultural, and educational services that they offer. We're one of only a handful remaining feminist bookstores in the United States, so thank you so much for your support. Our nonprofit Women's Voices Fund is the way that we as a store are able to bring you exciting events like this one, so please consider donating. And if you enjoyed tonight's event, make sure to check our events calendar for more good stuff to come. Tonight, it is my honor to introduce two original and nuanced thinkers who fearlessly examine and decode the unspoken boundaries that surround ourselves, our culture, and the wider world around us. Lisa Wedeen is the Mary R. Morton Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science and the College Director of the Chicago Center for Contemporary Theory and Associate Faculty in Anthropology at the University of Chicago. She is the recipient of the David Collier Mid-Career Achievement Award and an NSF Fellowship. Her publications include 3 books, Ambiguities of Domination, Peripheral Visions, and Authoritarian Apprehensions, Ideology, Judgment, and Mourning in Syria. Judith Butler is the author of several books, including Gender Trouble, Feminism, and the Subversion of Identity, Bodies That Matter, On the Discursive Limits of Sex, The Psychic Life of Power, Theories and Subjection, and The Force of Nonviolence. In addition to their numerous academic honors and publications, Butler is on the Academic Council of Jewish Voice for Peace, has published editorials and reviews in a wide range of journals and newspapers, including the New York Times, Time, and the London Review of Books, and has been featured on radio programs and podcasts throughout the world. Their new book, Who's Afraid of Gender, is an astounding tour de force of insight and analysis that exposes the root of fear and fantasy that have grown a backlash to the understanding of gender and urges us on to create new stories and imaginings of what we want the future to be. Please join me in welcoming Lisa Wedeen and Judith Butler.
Thank you for inviting me to be your interlocutor, Judith, and thank you to the staff at Haymarket Books for arranging this wonderful event. I'm truly honored. And I'm going to make a few comments and then pose various questions. I won't ask the questions all at once so that we can have a bit of a back and forth. Can you guys hear me in the back? Okay, great. I'm a scholar who has written on questions of ideology, and I've learned so much from your work, from gender trouble through Bodies That Matter, when you clarify your position on resistance and help us think about what it means to work the weaknesses of the system, to your remarkable recounting of the temporal impossibility of Althusser's allegory of the passerby in the psychic life of power, to your understanding and excitable speech of interpolations practices as not necessarily requiring belief to be powerful, just to take a few examples. And I've been grateful to you for your deep and penetrating thought. I think everyone here shares that gratitude. Now, Who's Afraid of Gender joins these works in its capacity to participate in and invite fresh thinking about the fraughtness of the category of gender, its vulnerability to phantasmatic uptake, to, in other words, to nightmarish, spectral, illusory, anxiety-laden fantasies. The phantasm of gender works, you argue, in part through the externalization of harm, a way of, and I'm quoting here, collecting and escalating multitudes of modern panics. The phantasmatic scene, you underscore, is not the same as a fantasy I happen to have in a moment of distraction. It's rather a way of organizing the world wrought by the fear of a destruction for which gender is held responsible. That's also quoted from the book. And yet the anti-gender movement is itself remarkably destructive, as you also highlight. It pursues its goals of eviscerating institutions and upending ordinary practices with terrifying efficacy, intent on harming those who seek to live and love without fearing for their lives, for being, say, non-binary or queer or fluid or trans, or for identifying in any way that seems non-heteronormative. Like dream work, you point out, anti-gender ideology operates, as does all ideology, through unconscious modes of condensation and displacement. And you write, it's worth quoting this, condensation names how disparate psychic and social elements are arbitrarily connected with one another and reduced to a single reality. Displacement names the way that one or many topics are pushed out of the mind or externalized in favor of the one that both stands for them and conceals them, unquote. One of the many brilliant moves of the book is to show how these two processes of condensation and displacement, which are enmeshed in various societal fears and anxieties, work to forge the phantasm of gender and to aid in its circulation. So the debt to the French psychoanalyst Jean Laplanche is explicit and beautifully rendered in the book. Equally helpful is your clear exposition of an interpretive method, really, which rather than being designed to demonstrate how psychoanalysis can be applied to the cultural phantasm called gender, explores how a, quote, range of cultural and social elements are reorganized through pathways or arrangements already operating at the level of the unconscious. So according to this logic, you argue, the anti-gender movement is guided by an inflammatory syntax. That is a way of ordering the world that absorbs and reproduces anxieties and fears about permeability, precarity, displacement, and replacement, loss of patriarchal power in both the family and the state, and loss of white supremacy and national purity. This is all on page 13, by the way. And I love this passage because it attunes us to the ways in which condensation and displacement actually work to contain a variety of fears within one big externalized fear, gender. Gender is a bit like Frederick Jameson's shark in his analysis of the movie Jaws, where the shark stands, I'm dating myself, some of you probably never even heard.
Everybody reads Jameson.
Yes. No, it's Jaws that I think dates.
We watched Jaws.
Okay. where the shark stands in for a host of inchoate fears wrought or strengthened, in our case, that is our world case, by neoliberal policies and the effects of deindustrialization, but whose excesses can hardly be adequately explained by these political economy conditions alone. This enactment of ideology critique that Butler performs refuses an understanding of the term ideology as simply a doctrine or worldview. Rather, you understand ideology as form. And it matters in part because whatever the content, its form is undergirded by fantasy investments that prove sticky. Ideology, in short, is hardly epiphenomenal or superstructural. It has identifying material and structuring effects. Moreover, in the sense that you use the term, false consciousness is not an issue. You share with Zizek and others the insight that a world that exists outside of ideology can only be a figment of ideology. We're all in ideology, in other words. And with remarkable lucidity, you bring to the fore the way in which ideology, understood in terms of its form, is diffusive and saturating, albeit unevenly. All that said, signing up for a version of ideology that does not traffic in claims of false consciousness hardly means that your ideology critique shies away from political judgment. On the contrary, your approach calls out the varying spurious, injurious, harmful, fear-laden, panic-inciting claims against LGBTQIA plus people. From your treatment of the Vatican in the introduction in Chapter 2, evangelical movements in Chapter 2, everything's kind of everywhere because it's just a remarkable book, to right-wing populists such as Orban, Bolsonaro, Meloni, Inclusion, and Trump, the latter especially in chapters 3 and 4, as well as anti-trans feminists and popular culture figures such as J.K. Rowling in chapter 5. Your writing is at once sweeping and meticulous, grounding your theoretical analysis in the specificities of this current movement's global and intensified attack on gender. And although you recognize this current assault in terms of a backlash against legal, political, and social gains made in the previous years, instead of reducing this attack to concepts like backlash, you track the intensified fantasies of restoration that undergird, say, Orban's images of family life and the revenant death drive infused sense of enjoyment that powers the Trump regime's moral sadism, a part of our contemporaries' fascist passions, Butler's term. I should add that I'm grateful for these concepts of moral sadism and fascist passions, which appear in various chapters of the book and were also beautifully worked out in a talk you gave a few nights ago at the University of Chicago. So my questions arise out of this gloss on the book and my appreciation for kinds of counter-imaginaries that can emerge from such a robust and theoretically rich critique of our current predicament. And my initial bundle of questions is three-pronged. First, I'd like to hear more about whether, in your view, the category of gender has specific characteristics that make it so available for phantasmatic incitements. And I'll stop there to let you to respond and also talk a little bit more about what you want to talk about.
No, that's great. It's great. Lisa, thank you so much. That was a really generous reading selection of the book, and I'm grateful to you. Usually when one writes a book like this, people take what they need from whatever chapter they need. and that's okay, it's like it's like, oh, this is the part that I need, for whatever I'm doing, thinking, whatever, my scholarship, my activism. But you actually read the whole thing.
I didn't want to have mud on my face.
Yeah, no, I really appreciate it. Thank you.
I loved it.
Yeah, it's funny when you finish a book, it's like, who's going to read this whole thing? Nobody reads a whole book anymore. Well, maybe people who come here do. Okay. Yeah, all right. You're the people who do. Well, first of all, thank you. And then, well, let's just mark the fact that we're living in a moment, a protracted moment, we don't know how long, in which the anti-gender ideology movement has announced itself in the United States and is now being elaborated by the Trump administration's anti-gender extremism executive order, one of, I think, the very first executive orders um, in late January, and that order does in fact reflect the basic beliefs of the anti-gender ideology movement, and it claims, well, first of all, it claims two things. One, that biological truth is going to be restored to the federal government. Like I thought, oh, they have a restoration fantasy, like all these trans queer people, we're going to take biological truth as we define it and return it to truth, right? But in fact, it's being returned to the federal government, which means that they get to decide what it is. No, they're not asking biologists to say what it is. They're not doing like deep research in developmental biology to find out like what how sex determination works. And there are, by the way, 16 paradigms, conflicting paradigms. Okay, that's not what they're doing. They're saying they're going to the Vatican. They're going to the immutability thesis that is part of the Vatican's contemporary rendition of natural law. And they say it's male and female, and it's based on these two gametes, the large gamete and the small gamete, and they think that takes care of it. And anybody who doesn't agree with that is an extremist, is an ideologist. And what they mean by ideology is false consciousness, and also believing in a false doctrine and imposing it. Like an ideologist is somebody who's accepted a false doctrine and imposes it on others. So the federal government comes along and says, oh, we've got the truth. We're going to dispel this false knowledge and return people to biological truth as we define it. So there's the gamete theory. Problem with the gamete, well, there are problems with gametes. I talked about this in Northwestern, I'm sorry. But the problem with the gametes is that, there's the large and then there's the small. But the large is female, the small comes from the large. Okay, so if we're really going to go gamete theory, we're basically saying there is one sex and it is female, and Luce Irigaray wins the day, right? Right, there's the sex which is one, there's only one, and that would, of course, be in line with a certain kind of creationism, like in the beginning there was a gamete. And it, but the other thing is that when you're practicing sex assignment in a hospital or at birth, wherever it may occur, whatever legal or medical person is deciding sex assignment, they can't actually inspect a gamete at that time, right? So it's a non-observable feature, which is not primarily binary. It's not originally binary. So if they want to say that's an original truth, they're going to have a little problem. Anyway, your question is a really important one, because what this executive order has done is it's built upon a lot of fear that some people have about trans life, about trans healthcare, but also about women or people with wombs who are engaged in reproductive sexual activity. None of those folks should have choice over whether they give birth or bring a pregnancy to termination. So it's against choice. It's against trans. It links feminism and trans life and all gender non-conforming people, but also gender-affirming health care for young people. It also stops research that is gender-based, which includes gender-based violence. Doesn't stop the research. It stops federal funding for the research, right? And it also eliminates chosen pronouns in all federal and governmental locations and agencies. which also means research and assistance and service for people who are non-binary, and also for people who are intersex. It eliminates intersex, it eliminates non-binary possibilities, and it's also in the service of eliminating trans identity as a legitimate existential reality. Right? So it's defying and denying the existential reality of trans people. Right? You do not exist. You do not exist. This is an executive order that says you do not exist. You're being returned to your assigned sex, and that assigned sex is the only one. I'm just not sure on what basis that assignment was made and who it was who made it, because those gametes are not available. Okay. I mean, I'm trying to make a little bit of a joke because, it's such a grim time.
Yeah.
And I'm not just making fun of it, although one wants to make fun of it. It's very powerful. It's affecting so many people's lives. It's unbelievable. Healthcare, education, books that are banned. I mean, I actually went to Florida and hung out at the new school the new college, sorry, new school's better. New college, the new college where they had banned the gender books, thrown them out, thrown them into a trash bin, and dismantled the gender studies program. And, but the bookstore at that place bought 250 copies of this book and handed it out to everybody who came to.
Yeah.
Right? I just want you to know that there's a struggle alive and well in the state of Florida. And I met a lot of interesting queer, feminist, and anti-racist people, helping out when migrants are being deported and all the rest. But to go back to your question, look, I think gender is very intimate for a lot of people. Mm-hmm. I mean, if they understand gender as gender identity, and we could talk about the history of the concept of gender, and for a lot of feminism in the 70s and 80s and even into the 90s, gender was not your identity. Gender was a framework for understanding a certain operation of power, right? Gender was like, the gendering of education, the gendering of public space, the gender division of labor. Like, what are we, socialist feminism depended on that concept and still does. So in that case, you were kind of looking at labor and public life and medicine and institutions and figuring out what the gender dynamic is and how to understand inequality. But you weren't saying, this is the gender I am. But gender identity became an important issue for many reasons. But to the degree that the popular notion of gender is now linked to gender identity, it hits people at the site of identity, right? So, I mean, I've spoken to a cis man, conservative person who said to me, you're going to take my gender away from me. I said, why would I do that? Or how would I do that? But the fantasy of it is true.
Yeah.
And Georgia Maloney has said this explicitly, that the gender ideology people will take your sex away, she says. And that's how she campaigned. And then she won. Right? And what was she saying? I mean, the intimate fear of having somebody come along and tell you you are not the gender you think you are, when this is your position in the world, your possibly your power, very possibly your sexuality, very possibly your place in the family, community, religion, your connection to God. I mean, there are a lot of ways that gender can work, especially for, heteronormative cis people who have very, very strong stakes in it. And they want to think and know that it's immutable. And Trump is saying to them, it's immutable. Right? What's he saying to them? No one's going to take it away. It's immutable. It cannot be changed. So he's not just saying to trans people, you've made a mistake by changing your legal status. He's also saying to a vast number of cis straight people, no one's going to take your gender away. No one's going to expropriate this. This is yours, and it's immutably yours. Now, of course, if we look into the world, if we look carefully and say, well, where is this practice happening of people being stripped of their sex identities? I mean, has that actually happened as a result of a gender studies classroom or a set of publications by Haymarket, or I mean, has that happened that somebody like said, "Oh, this book took my sex away" or something? Well, the only people who are actively stripping people of their rights to have the legal sex they have are the anti-gender ideology people, right? And so that includes Orban and Putin and Meloni, right, heart of Europe, and Trump and Bolsonaro, and Millet will, if he can, reverse that incredibly progressive uh, law of gender identity in Argentina. So, and the German AfD, even though they claim to have gay people in their midst, that doesn't really tell us anything. So the answer is that there is an intimate dimension to this, and people are afraid of it. And then there's another dimension to it, which is the fear of ideas, the notion that your kid will go to school and they'll learn about gay and lesbian lives, they'll learn about queer parenting, they'll learn about trans people, and the history, the large array of differences among them, the regional differences, what's happening, what the legal struggles have been, what the health needs might be. They could learn. They could read some poems. They could read some beautiful literature, some history, something. And somehow that exposure to the very idea will convert them, conscript them, indoctrinate them, as if to learn about something is to be involuntarily seduced by it and to become the very thing you read about. So the attribution of indoctrination to education on gender and sexuality, its diversity. I mean, if we're still allowed to use that word, I thought that was a kind of vanilla word myself, and now it's like, oh, we're gonna have to start saying diversity, right? Just to okay. So anyway, that is a major issue, and we should be aware that the success of these right-wing movements that are anti-gender and, of course, anti-migrant and pervasively white supremacist, and we're seeing this played out right now in all kinds of ways with rights stripping and detention and deportation. It's part of the same cloth. It's not all the same thing. That they are making a deep personal appeal to people's anxieties and fears at a very intimate level.
And do you think that the anti-gender movement's repressive techniques link? You kind of just said they do link those strategies to other kinds of strategies, like those that are deporting immigrants, legal residents of the United States, or punishing people for protesting against genocide in Palestine?
Yes. I think that the way this version of authoritarianism is working, and not just in the U.S., but in several places. This is a transnational authoritarianism that has actually come late to the U.S. So if you, in the global, I don't know what it's called, something about global something in the book, it's a chapter. Maybe it's like the global scene or something. I try to explain that it moved through Latin America, it's moved through Eastern Europe, that through the World Congress of the Family and other major right-wing conservative Christian organizations, it's been moving from area to area and evolving since the 1990s. But in the U.S., at least now, the fact that you could, that the administration can negate people's legal rights, that's on the books. It's like, what else will they negate? They're stripping people of fundamental rights they have to define themselves and to take advantage of a shift in legal status, which is um, possible and legal, to have access to health care, which is humane and obligatory, and for trans youth to have access both to education and to health care, including counseling.
Mhm.
I mean, there are Texas parents who've been vilified and criminalized for sending their genderqueer kid, who's like trying to figure out, which way am I going? How do I feel? And how do I understand myself? Right? Open, big questions that young people have. They were criminalized for sending their kid to therapy so that he had a safe space in which to explore that. And education also can't be that a safe space in which to explore that. So how do you find your way?
The fear of mutability, it really seems to undergird
Yes.
the sort of hostilities that we're experiencing from this repressive authoritarian.
Yes.
I mean, not, you pointed out a couple of days ago, not yet fascist, but the movement's fascist.
Well, I think the fascist appeal is made to strengthen the authoritarian powers and to expand the executive branch way beyond what it ever has been, and to contest the balance of powers and to contest the power of the judiciary. So, so executive or autocratic right stripping is linked to the right stripping of deported people, especially of international students who are living with fear. I don't know how many of you are living with fear, but my guess is some of you are living with fear, right? I'm sorry. You should not be living with fear. But they can you could be in the middle of a legal process. You followed every rule, and they can still take you out, right? We saw you at an encampment. Somebody said you were at the encampment. All encampments are Hamas. All encampments are signs that you are an enemy combatant who's been allowed into this country and must be expelled, right? That's that. So nullification, expulsion, carceral containment, detention, in Salvadoran prisons or Panama or wherever, or along the border. There have been some hideous detention centers for a really long time under Biden as well. Let's remember, he's no angel. Anyway, but they are linked. They're different forms of rights stripping, abandonment, nullification, expulsion, and forcible displacement. And I think we need to think very carefully about how these things are being linked, because our solidarities and our analysis has to link them, and we can't be sectarian. We can't be just in my corner. And, people who are protesting against the genocide in Gaza are being deported for having stood up for justice and opposing a genocide, which is an international crime formulated in 1948 in the Genocide Convention, right? So they're speaking in the name of a post-Holocaustal principle of justice. I'm about to lose my shit here. Okay. Okay. But the thing about those deportations is that those folks are also, what are they objecting to? Bombardment, killing, tactical starvation, but also constant movement, forcible displacement of Gazans and Palestinians from their homes, which has been part of the colonial settlement project from the beginning, right? So these are linked, and we need to be making those links and understanding how they're linked, and make our solidarities on the basis of our knowing understanding of the deep links.
You also make a really important distinction between backlash and restoration. And I was wondering, part of what you're doing in the book is also inviting us to imagine an otherwiseness to this current dismal time. And I wonder whether you think there are different political implications of the backlash story
Yes.
and the restoration story.
Yes, there are. Thank you. So people who talk about regression or backlash, well, they're two different things, but they both assume like, oh, we were making progress, like everything was moving forward, and then there were folks who didn't like the forward motion, and so they beat it back, and we have backlash with a reaction to a progressive agenda. Of course, that's true at one level. The problem is that the appeal of this movement has everything to do with a promise, at least the anti-gender ideology movement, but I would say with the fascist of the new authoritarianism as well. A promise of a restoration of a prior order where there were males and females, and you knew the difference, and there was nothing in between and nothing outside, where marriage was heterosexual and conjugal, and you only procreated within its terms, where white supremacy was uncontested, and where you didn't have to watch your language because everybody was getting, insulted or offended or acting as a linguistic cop or whatever it is they say. So this kind of desire to return to a former time of stability and dominance, especially for white men, I think we can just say it like that. That's a very strong pull, and if we just call it a backlash, then we're noting a sociological phenomenon, and we're assuming that there's forward and backwards movements. But the restoration fantasy wants to return. It doesn't just want to pull back the progressive legislation or nullify it. It wants to return to a former time. And it's making a promise, and it's responding to a promise of an impossible return. And what worries me about the progressive agenda is we can't just keep moving forward like, oh, we'll win the next round, we'll win the next election, we'll get a new bill out that which gives us abortion rights or gives us trans rights. I mean, of course we do need those legal struggles, and I've never been more grateful to radical lawyers in my life, okay, so don't get me wrong, but the radical lawyers, as indispensable as they are not going to pave the way toward a revolutionary future. Right, because that's not paved with lawsuits. But what does is appealing to people's dreams and their fears and anxieties, and giving them another way to think about what they're fearing. Showing them what they don't need to fear, showing them what they do need to care about, or having a vision of a way of creating a compelling version of the world that actually persuades people that I'd rather live in that world of equality and freedom and justice. That's a beautiful world. We're going to all breathe more freely. We're going to treat each other well. We're going to be less frightened in such a world. And but how would we on the left appeal to these deep anxieties and fears that that are being exploited by the right?
Yeah.
We can't just ignore them, right? We actually have to appeal to them in a different way.
And that gets me to a question. I was very intrigued by your acknowledgement that the people who organized to prevent, say, trans people from getting affirmative confirming care, or who conjure up horror stories about unisex bathrooms, or who make slippery slope arguments about gay, lesbian, and queer people parenting or whatever, will probably not be convinced by the arguments you make in the book. You say this.
That's true.
You do. So and you're clear that these folks are not necessarily interested in good faith deliberation or evidence-based arguments, and yet there are moments in the book where I do see an aspirational effort to persuade or to do the pedagogical work of opening up those audiences to possibilities. So I wondered if you could say a little bit more about, is it ambivalence or?
No, my best hope is that the confused center will get something from the book. Right, the ones like, I don't know, like, what is that trans education thing about? And I don't know, like, why should they get hormones? Isn't that bad for the body? And, It's like, well, let's sit down and talk. And what about prisons? Like, wow, like trans women in women's prisons. Like, well, do you ever think what would happen to them if they were men's prisons? And why is it that they got moved back immediately after they were moved? And who is it who's really doing the violence in prison? Anyway, it's the guards. And what is really violent about prisons? It's the institution. It's a violent institution. Right? I mean, in other words, you have to lay it out. You have to, like, quietly, I don't know, maybe a little less sarcastically than and I can arrive at a non-sarcastic place. But I think one has to, one has to, like, take those, like, slightly, well, not slightly, like, very distorted, fearful images also of migrants, which, and remember, the Trump campaign put the migrant fear and the trans fear together in claiming through its robocalls that Kamala Harris would authorize trans surgeries on migrants. Okay, a total lie, but it really did a certain kind of political work. First of all, Kamala Harris, black, educated, coastal, no, woman, no. She is a liberal who says they, and she also will authorize these surgeries. Like, where and when? Who is talking about this? It's a total fantasy. But it allows the fear of the migrant coming in, the fear of trans, the fear of the black woman who's a coastal elite, all of these things to come together. And then you just say no to the whole thing and Trump gets elected. I'm not saying it's that simple, but it's one example of a very tactical deployment of a phantasmatic scene to absorb people's anxieties and redirect them toward a right-wing authoritarian solution that promises a restoration of a prior order and a less frightening world for some.
And that fear of being changed or
Changed, I know.
somehow.
Well, I think it's a fear of loss, especially for those who experience their whiteness or their gender as incontestable, right? So it might seem like, I mean, at an intimate level, it's like, don't take my whiteness away, don't take my masculinity away. That would be castrating, and I would lose my dignity as a person, as I understand it, and I would lose. But at another level, it's like I would lose my domination.
Yeah.
I would lose my supremacy.
Mm-hmm.
If I were able to say simply, I kind of like my gender. I'm not about to change it. Thank you. I'm gonna live out this world in the gender I was assigned because it works for me. Thank you. And if it doesn't work for you, you should have the right to change that and find your way with a different legal sex and we can all live together and go to Whole Foods or something. Right? I mean, just a simple kind of liberal Christian understanding. Like, okay, like I kind of like mine, I'm like, it works for me really well. Yeah, just being straight. Like, yep, definitely straight. Definitely straight. Not going to change. That's not going to change. But somebody else, bisexual, somebody else has a different life history. Somebody else will never be straight. In the same way, you will never not be straight. It's like, oh, okay, we live in a world in which both of those utterances are possible. I mean, is it so terrifying? But it is.
Yeah.
It is.
And these people have already experienced loss. That's the other aspect.
They are terrified of losing more.
Losing more.
They've lost their sense of centrality and supremacy, or they see it's under contestation.
Mm-hmm.
So when we talk about a backlash, we're actually talking about people who are deeply ungrounded by progressive movements that are trying to establish equality. And equality is loathed by some people. It never ceases to amaze me how much some people can hate equality.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah.
Do I have time for one more question? I said I was going to keep time, but then I put my phone away.
You're good.
I'm okay. Oh, thank you. So this is a kind of more I don't know, typical question, so excuse me in advance, but you mentioned how your understanding of gender's social constructedness has changed since writing Gender Trouble.
Oh, yeah.
And I wonder if you take us through those shifts in your understanding and analysis, which is so responsive to changing circumstances, including new kinds of knowledge production. And yeah.
Okay.
Really, chapter 6 onwards.
You know, I've been doing this for 35 years.
She said we had time.
Okay. Well, okay, don't make a comedy routine out of it. I think in Gender Trouble, written really in the late 80s, although it appeared in the early 90s for the most part, was dealing with the sex-gender distinction and trying to change it, trying to take it apart in certain ways. But the older sex-gender distinction that I was working with assumed that sex was a biological reality and that gender was the social or cultural organization of that sex. And what was great about that distinction was the Simone de Beauvoir idea that your biology is not destiny. So you could have this sex, but that doesn't say anything about how you're going to live or love or what kind of work you're going to do or what kind of person you are. So it was a feminist slogan and precept of the time that I was working with. But I was also aware, even in Gender Trouble, that sex assignment was a problem because if there was a form of power that was deciding what sex you could possibly be, and that was binary, then the cultural and the social are kind of operating before sex comes into the picture. Now that led some people to think Butler thinks sex is an effective discourse or sex is an effective history, but it doesn't have any material reality. And so imagine all the people who didn't like that. And that came at me a lot. And then, of course, I did work with some graduate students on sex determination in non-human species, and I certainly read Donna Haraway extensively. But I became more interested in the biological sciences under COVID, and in particular, the different ways of thinking about immunology. And there's a theory within immunology called co-construction, and it suggests that the body is not a defense against an alien element like the virus, but it is actually in a relationship with external realities all the time, and it doesn't defend itself against them primarily. It actually takes them and incorporates them and can tolerate some and can not tolerate others. But the fact is that none of us would survive if we didn't take in what is external to us, and if we weren't acting on the world that we understand as external. So the whole idea of what is internal and what is external had to kind of come apart, but so too did the idea that biology is somehow separable from environmental factors or society or culture or institutions. They're always they're interacting and they're co-constructing the organisms that we are. Now, when it comes to sex determination, it's also, I think, quite interesting because it turns out that, the Olympic Committee can figure out what your chromosomes are, they can figure out what your hormones are, but what they can't figure out necessarily is what activates your chromosomes and what has transformed your hormones in the course of your life. So the co-constructionist model, which I find very interesting, suggests that the world has to act on us for us to be produced as an organism at all.
Mm-hmm.
So, and we're constantly being acted on, and we're constantly internalizing. And so when we think about what activates so-called sexual development, it's always an interactive scene of some kind. And that takes us way beyond what the sex-gender distinction was doing and my early Foucauldian kind of efforts to twist that.
That's a remarkable account of the trend.
Well, there's even then an ecological dimension to this perspective, which I also find really important given climate catastrophe. So, yes, I have gone through many pathways since then.
I'll just ask, is there a question that I haven't asked you that you want me to ask you, or that you want to answer without me asking?
I don't know. I think I'd like to know what other people might want to talk about.
Let's do that. Let's open it up for a little.
Okay.
Yeah, that's great.
Thank you.
Yeah, for sure. Why don't you field your own questions?
Okay. An eager hand with dark glasses. Yeah.
Thank you so much for this discussion. This was wonderful. My question is, I'm drawn to the fact that you use the word phantasm throughout this, and I was wondering what the origin of that word was for you in this project. I was thinking, as I was looking through it, about like and haunting and sociological imagination, and so I'm wondering what's available.
Yeah.
That has this kind of spectral or speculative element to it that maybe isn't available, that you found intriguing other than a different term.
Yeah, thank you. Well, I very much like Avery Gordon's work. And I didn't think about the haunted quality of the phantasm, although it is in line with what I'm saying about fears and anxieties getting clustered there. So I think there are two concepts that work in the book. One of them is the phantasmatic scene, which I take from Jean Laplanche, and I'm suggesting that that works through a kind of syntax that clusters different moments of fear, anxiety, or desire together in a particular image or story, and that absorbs those elements and also has an inflammatory or inciting effect on people. And then the phantasm I think of as an element in the phantasmatic scene. So not something, not exactly a ghost, although it can be ghosted, but rather like gender ideology itself, the term. Like, is there anybody who says, yes, I practice gender ideology, or I defend gender ideology, or I work in the field of gender ideology. I teach this. No, it's a slur, right? It's an allegation, and it exists as a discursive item or as a believable item to the degree that it arrives as an allegation or a slur or an insult or a caricature. But things like that, and even the migrant, the undocumented migrant, illegal, they would say, suddenly there's a figure that is circulating. Suddenly it's a figure of fear. People get worked up about it. It contains a lot of anxieties and fears about their own life, their future, whatever's going on, their racism. It's all collected there. So it's the collected character and the inciting or inflammatory character that I'm trying to get at. And hauntology, as Avery Gordon would put it, has a role to play, because what's being relived or reimagined, or where is the absent past in that particular kind of phantasm? I think that's a really good question. It's probably not one that I explored enough, but one could. Okay, over here, please.
Thank you so much for coming out to speak with us today. I found what you were saying about the the confused center to be really interesting because there are so many people, I think, in many of our lives who are that person who we're trying to push, hopefully, further to the left.
Yeah.
But for me, it's my mom and my brother, and, you know, I've come at it in so many different ways, like, how can I have these conversations with them? How can I, like, I don't know, send them an article or, like, a TV show? And they're just very hesitant to discuss it with me.
Yeah.
But the book, I think, is really accessible, mostly because
it was hard. It was hard.
It's accessible because these current events and uses things you see on the news and in the newspaper. Is there something in this book that I can bring to my mother? No, I'm serious. Like, what do you think? Is there something in this book, and you're from the book, that I can say, I read this, I thought you might be interested in it, that you think somebody who is truly just like the confused center will find truly accessible and not scary?
Okay, so first of all, I don't know your mother, so I can't say. But I understand. Yeah. You could give your mother the introduction. You could give her the section on Trump. But there are a couple of articles in The Guardian, one from a few years ago and one more recently, that she could read together. Yeah, maybe collect some things from popular culture and see whether she's open to it. And tell her you want to have that dialogue and that she shouldn't shy away. You know? I mean, I can't tell you how many people have said this to me. And one student at Stanford was actually very moving to me, said she goes to the South and her white parents are Trump supporters and she has a hard time having any conversation with them. But she doesn't want to break with them totally. And she said, I want to hold their humanity at the same time that I'm disagreeing with them. And I just thought, wow, if only the Christian left, could hear that, right? Because the problem is not Christianity as such; it's Christian nationalism. It's Vatican doctrinaire. It's evangelical white supremacy, and nationalism, and homophobia, transphobia, misogyny, racism, all of it together. So, but there's, especially if people have a religious background, there are ways to come around, because if that young person is saying to her parents, or about her parents, I have to find a way to hold their humanity as I disagree with them. Why aren't those parents saying, I want to hold the humanity of my trans kid? I want to keep this relationship with my trans kid, even as I remain bewildered, confused, afraid. Right? So there is something in there that is really important, and whether it's an ethic, a secular ethic, or a religious ethic, there's a way of putting the relationship first and of accepting that we don't always know each other as well as we think we do, and that being open to each other in a way that doesn't assume you have the answers to the question, who are you and what is it you're looking for in this world? Really listening when people tell you. So, I don't know. That's my little... Okay. Yes, there's a red sweater in the back.
But it was helpful wearing the red sweater.
Yeah.
So when you're talking about this fear, I'm maybe trying to do sort of a hopeful twist on what's going on, but I'm just wondering, where's all this fear coming from? And I do understand that the fear is like sort of self-producing, right? That it's like, fear breeds fear. But I'm also just wondering if the fear is partially because gender ideology is working, right? Like that there's like that we are getting closer to sort of we were getting closer to something that we were hoping for, and that intense fear that we're seeing right now is a reaction to that, in the same way that a state would build a wall, or like there's this intense attempt.
Yeah.
You understand what I'm saying?
I do. I think that's partially right, but I think there's something else. which is that people, many people live with a lot of fear anyway. There's a fear of what capitalism has done to their working lives. There's a fear of the destruction of unions. There's a fear of climate catastrophe and forcible displacement and loss of jobs. There's a fear of unpayable debt. There's a fear of new viruses and a fear of the global order that is no longer understood. I mean, we can name a lot of different things that people are really very frightened about, including the loss of their homes if they have them, or the loss of shelter, if they have that. How many people are not able to pay their debts, who don't have a livable wage, and how do we understand the accumulation of wealth among these oligarchs, these billionaire oligarchs, as so many people find that their wages are offering them less and less in terms of the power to maintain life or maintain their dependents if they have them. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of reasons why people are really frightened. I mean, unfortunately, those who promise them relief from their fear through authoritarian means are also trafficking in fear, which is why almost everybody in this room is afraid, and why a lot of people who voted for Trump are now afraid and feeling like, oh, wait a minute, what did I do? This is actually going to ruin my wage and my ability to keep a home or a refined one. So, I mean, I think we need to do some serious canvassing to figure out what are the basic fears and anxieties, and what would it mean for the left to name them differently. I think Bernie has done that. I think AOC does that. I think Naomi Klein does that. I think Arundhati Roy does that. I believe that there are a lot of people out there who do that really well, and in different ways. But we should be appealing at that level. That's why the argument in the book is not going to change the world, but a different kind of appeal may well do that. I mean, part of it is a fear of gender itself for some of the reasons we've talked about, and the success of gender freedoms and gender justice and the opposition to gender violence and all of that, for sure. People are very freaked out by the change in life that implies, like how people are living, and they're afraid about their children, and they're afraid about all that. But some of that is also displaced from these other broader fears. So when the Vatican says gender is what is responsible for the destruction of the world, civilization, man, woman, etc., or Orban says gender will destroy the life as we know it, or Putin says national values and the spirit of Russia will be destroyed by gender. Wow, that's like the family, church, the state, all in one, where gender is somehow being identified as this enormously destructive power. In Brazil, it was a diabolical ideology, and I represented the devil, him, herself. I'm not sure what gender I had. But seriously, so some of these phantasms, say gender is the cause of your problem, or migrants are the cause of your problem, right? And that's a great deflection from capitalism, from extractivism, from war, from genocide, from a lot of different things that are going on. Yes, right here. Please.
As you've been talking, I've been kind of trying to wrap my brain around it, and there is perhaps a fallacy of binary in this question, but I was wondering if you could speak more to how you make sense of the gender, especially in your evolution, gender as a framework, as a form, as an ideology that we're interpreted into, but also something that is, and I think everyone in the room agrees, something that is true about each of us.
Maybe. You might be luckier than I am.
Or just something that folks that can identify with, that as they search and try to find their identity, and how you kind of make sense of something that is, again, folks are interpolated into it, but also folks can go on their own journey. This is something that, I guess as I'm speaking about it, is violent, in the sense of folks being called into it, the male, female, the frameworks that people are put into categories. But also, for a lot of people, can hold a lot of joy in understanding their gender and their self-identity.
Right.
And I understand that as I'm phrasing this, there's a binary, or there's a fallacy of binary.
No, there's not a fallacy. I don't think so. I think you're saying something really important. We're called to gender against our will. We're given a sex assignment against our will. So it starts as a radically involuntary situation. And it's also a situation where the sex you're given or the gender that is, interpolated becomes the way in which you're recognized as a person in the world. Like, that this is one of the parameters within which I exist. I'm being hailed this way. I'm being called this way. I'm being treated a certain way. And there's always then, and it can happen at a very early age. It can happen, I think, at almost any age, that there can be a real disturbance with that. Like a no, or a absolutely not, or how did this happen, or what's wanted of me? This is not right, or this is maybe, yes, I am this gender, but not in the way that I'm being treated. There are a lot of different responses to that. And some of them are joyful, and some of them are great. Like, love this gender, works for me. Having having a lovely time with this assignment, right? And that's great. Somebody's like moving through the world in a gender they love. Like, great, we want that. We should all be moving through the world in a gender we love if it's possible. Those of us, might be some who are too neurotic for that, but okay. But seriously, I mean, that's lovely. And if we want that for people, if we think that's a good thing, then we would presumably want it for everybody. Why not? You don't want people moving through the world in a gender they're not supposed to be, or that's doing massive damage to them. There is an involuntary part. Like, we are formed against our will, and we're formed by all kinds of powers, and not just the familiar ones, but community and religion and schools and all the institutions Althusser mentions, and more, state jurisdictions. We're called things, we're moved around. And there is an involuntary dimension to that. Every time I'm in a restaurant with somebody who calls me a lady, it's like, I mean, at a certain point, I just become kind of ethnographic, like, oh, there it goes again. Look at that. Like, what's the machine that reproduces that? Like, wow, wow, all the time, wow. But, okay. But, I can't grab all those interpolations as they come out and go, no, not that one. I couldn't possibly. It's a stream of those, right? But then how does one find one's way? One navigates that field of power, and one does it also through assuming power and finding one's own power and strategies of power and collective power, right? Which is why power is not just domination, but also the possibility of agency and creation and collectivity. And I don't know if that's binary, non-binary, whatever it is, but that seems to me the name of the predicament. And I think there's a gentleman in the back with your hand up. Yes. I'm calling you gentleman. You will take that interpretation. Yeah. You're not a gentleman.
Perfect study, I'm correct.
I just interpolated you. Yeah. But sometimes the interpolation is also like an invitation. Like, does that work for you? Like,
I happen to be one of those undesirables, both like one of these monstrous entities, an immigrant, trans person, and an activist of sorts. But what I found to be incredibly interesting since moving to the United States and kind of seeking protections from the powers that be was this reaction of fear, which I kind of, to this day, don't really fully understand. It's been 5 years and I struggle. Because where I'm from, the Middle East, Egypt, Tunisia, North Africa, the reaction has often been disgust, infantilization, bewilderment maybe, confusion, confliction when like I show up in my truth, be it I have makeup on, my hair is extra curly that day, I'm wearing a mini skirt, whatever it may be. Rarely is it fear. And yet, when I am here in the seat of power, in the heart of empire, where I am more afraid than I ever was, given that the entities I'm coming up against are more powerful than folks at home, albeit potentially less violent in the public sphere as opposed to folks at home. Here I'm confronted with fear, and no longer disgust, and no longer infantilization. Perhaps sometimes when I read stories of like the 80s and the 70s and the 60s, that was also kind of the discourse around queer bodies. They were disgusting, they were dirty, they were sinful. Why have we gone from disgust and infantilization, which often the cure for was, A, we're strong in numbers, here we are, we're not babies, and disgust, the resolution to that was, well, we can dress nice, we can look nice, we're presentable, we're just like you. We haven't figured out what the discursive weapon is to fight fear. If I'm a monster and I show up in numbers, now I'm only proving to you I'm more monstrous. If I am just like you, then that is even scarier because I can hide in plain sight. So the things that we've used in the past to fight those feelings, in fact, not only not work, but exacerbate the situation against the bodies that we are trying to befriend, love, and be in companionship and community with.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. I guess my response is twofold. One is, we can work at the interpersonal level, but people who are phobic don't generally let you do that, right? So you can't even begin the conversation because the proximity is dangerous, or aversive, or something like that. But then I think there's a broader question, which is, how is the combination of racism and transphobia being produced and reproduced here and elsewhere, such that you or people here, people in communities that are trans communities of color, understand themselves as the new undesirables, especially if they are here on visas. And I think we have to understand it as part of white supremacy, which also works through transphobia and heteronormativity. We have to keep all that in mind and figure out what those sources are and go for those sources. So there's an interpersonal exchange that's possible sometimes. And we could talk about that if you want. But I also think we need to be tracking the broader movements of Christian nationalism and white supremacy as it's producing these figures and making people live as those figures, like making people feel that they are those figures in their bodies, in the world. And as such, feeling dispensable, like you deportable, degradable. So I think we have to maybe look at some of those broader structures and focus our politics against them. The Heritage Foundation, which gave us Project 2025, is being enacted almost step by step, and the attack on universities is one of them. But also now there's a Project Esther, which is a derivative of Project 2025, which basically says that everybody who stands up for Palestine belongs to a Hamas support network, and is an undesirable and must be either silenced or deported if possible, and that's, we're living in a massive incitation of hatred right now, and also a hallucinatory celebration of the power to negate people's lives, right? There are people who are reveling in the power to negate people's lives. And that's a raw sadism in my view. That's gotten institutionalized. So let's keep the big picture, because some of us will be living it existentially. And others have an obligation, actually, let's hope everybody has the power to speak out against it and to call for a different world. But I think really important to allow yourself to be regenerated through community and collectivity. Like if we're suffering alone, we're in big trouble. And it's a long struggle. So how you get regenerated, how you find your joy, how you find your connection and your humor is a really important thing right now. Because none of us are going to get through it without it. And good lawyers. And there's and check out the Campus Sanctuary Network because it will help. It's giving people so many pathways. It's really important.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, I'm supposed to.
Yeah.
Call?
Yes.
There's somebody behind. Yeah. Okay. Go ahead, Pink.
Thank you for being here tonight. I wanted to ask you, what's something that gives you gender euphoria amongst all this fear?
Gender euphoria? You know, I've been thinking about gender dysphoria and euphoria. And I know that some people do feel gender euphoria, especially after, I know a lot of people after top surgery just felt like incredible exhilaration. But living with that, does that stay? Is it a mode of life? Or is it a kind of transport that we sometimes get to have and we're lucky when we do? But I'm not good at this topic. I'm not good on this topic because I kind of think neither, for me at least, God, this could be unpopular. I don't like gender dysphoria, and I don't like gender euphoria to the degree that it's the pathological and the anti-pathological as they're bound together. And I think the everyday life of gender survival, persistence, and joy might be a little more modest and maybe more appropriate for my age. I'm not really sure.
Thank you very much. That was extraordinary.
Okay. I just wanted to explain that I broke my arm 2 weeks ago and I cannot sign. I'm very sorry that I cannot sign, but it actually does.